A young girl with an affinity for dishevelled lamps.
귀엽네요. 귀엽죠?
And a personality less innocent than she makes it appear. The high-ranking criminal boss who, through her, has found another release for his long-kempt desires of being a respected patriarch, and the solemn executioner whom he trustfully dispatches on an exceedingly simple task, but one which has been set with the possibility of an unexpectedly dangerous decision presenting itself to him and his confused and woefully dewy-eyed state of mind. When director Kim Ji-woon set out to make a violent action flick during a major turning point in Korean cinema in which revenge thrillers were at the height of their influence, he sought to combine several techniques and creative decisions in a way that produced a familiar product, but one which still stood out and made a name for itself. Firstly, the brooding and unforgiving darkness in many of these recent Korean crime thrillers that have become the face of the country's cinematic output to the rest of the world, being some of the most successful and respected in their genres, not just in the year of their release, but in the history of filmmaking. And at the forefront of this revolution was director Park Chan-wook and his infamous Vengeance trilogy. Away from the gritty violent thrillers, there exists the works of people like Lee Chang-dong, who found critical acclaim in the late 90s and whose filmography tells stories full of melodrama about psychological suffering and the memories which haunt his tragic characters. Outside of Korea, explosive crime flicks like those directed by famed Hong Kong filmmaker John Woo exhibit chaotically groundbreaking action sequences that combine lessons from the stylish neo-noir genre with classical wuxian kung fu. There's also the heightened reality of ultra-violence seen in Tarantino's Kill Bill and the intense crescendo climax of De Palma's Scarface, both of which make perfect references for the deadly red-soaked shootout seen at the end of Bittersweet Life. But perhaps the most interesting source of inspiration is in the characteristics popularised during the French New Wave era of filmmaking, in rejection of the traditional approach to crime-related storytelling that you would have seen in the classical noir genre of the 40s and 50s. The intricacies of human emotion and the potential for dark and bloodied actions that exist within is something that Kim Ji-woon, amongst other directors of Korean revenge thrillers, likes to explore in all of his films, and A Bittersweet Life could be strongly considered his finest attempt at this. As a baseline, the film achieves having a rich personality due in part to its awareness of the generic stories and characters that are presented here on a surface level of what is actually a far more profound divergence from what is typically portrayed in such a movie. And as it turns out, this deceptive simplicity proves to be a most suitable foundation from which all other aspects are enhanced, no matter how ambiguous they may be. A beat-for-beat revenge thriller story telling a tale of a chaotic, soft-spoken hero who finds himself on the bad side of luck and who seeks a selfish justice through the destruction of those who had wronged him, with a certain attractive finesse, but which comes at the expense of inflicting more harm and pain on himself than was ever before imaginable. The same can be said for his enemies, but at the end of it all, it's up for us to decide whether it was all worth the sacrifice. When Mr. Kang chose Sun-woo as the grunt to go on a secret mission for matters concerning his personal life, he may not have trusted him as much as he leads us and Sun-woo himself to believe, but one thing's for sure, he certainly wasn't expecting the decisions made by him and Sun-woo independently to cascade to the demise of everything their lives were worth. And the film cuts away before we can witness the ripples it will have all throughout the criminal underworld.
누구한테 말도 못하고 속으로 끙끙 앓다가 내가 우리 마누라한테 말 못해도 너한테는 하지 않냐?
The first sign, despite all face value warnings, that this film won't become another basic solo hero saves the day story is when Sun-woo meets with his boss and the man doesn't appear to be the psychotically twisted, henchman-killing tyrant that you might expect from a character such as this. Instead, he exhibits a very calm, very mature demeanour, taking the utmost care when deciding whether to reveal even the slightest amount of vulnerability with Sun-woo sitting before him.
아무도 몰라. 내가 이런 고민한다는 거.
And based on the way Sun-woo conducts himself in the opening scene, it's not hard to see why Mr. Kang would see him as the ideal employee to go about investigating something that doesn't really have any impact on their business, and in reality should probably stay separate. But these are criminals after all. I can't really fault Mr. Kang for using the tools at his disposal to confirm or deny his suspicions. The task is this: to follow Mr. Kang's girlfriend, finding out whether or not she is seeing other men, and if she is, to deal with it. The simplicity of the task is deceptive, and it's never really fully explained whether Mr. Kang is using it as an excuse to test Sun-woo, or whether he really trusts him to the extent of giving such little guidance in dealing with this issue should it turn out that way. I'm of the opinion, at least based off just the people Mr. Kang interacts with on screen, that Sun-woo is the only person he trusts enough on both a personal and professional level to deal with this task, which means he wasn't lying when he said as such to Sun-woo himself. But that prior even to giving him the task, he is convinced that the girl has been cheating on him, and chooses to send out his most reliable man for the best chance of confirmation, and for someone who best understands the appropriate punishment without being directly told so. The likelihood is there are others whom Kang could have trusted to do this. People who may not be as trustworthy as Sun-woo, but who wouldn't dare double-cross their boss or underperform.
잘못했음. 딱 이 네 마디다. 그냥 가라.
Mr. Kang comes across to me as the kind of manipulative kingpin to make the most of an opportunity to test those who serve him, just to see how valuable they are and how they can be used down the line. Sending in his best man just shows us the seriousness of the emotions that Kang is putting in this girl, which is the very thing that makes disappointing him so dangerous. Not that Sun-woo seems overly aware of that danger at this point in time. Instead, he seems relatively laid back, like he's just left the office for a breath of fresh air, and that's in spite of the red flags we get from Mr. Kang, such as his intolerance of being lied to.
놀라긴. 내가 속고는 못 살잖냐. 속아서 하는 사랑은 사랑이 아니야, 임마.
And the fact that he chose Sun-woo for this job and likes him specifically because he's never been in love, as he puts it.
사랑해 본 적 있어? 없어. 넌 없어. 그래서 너한테 이런 일을 맡기는 거야. 그래서 널 좋아하는 거야, 임마.
As if he feels that Sun-woo's inexperience of anything beyond the boundaries of his job makes him of zero threat. Sun-woo's laid-back behaviour upon setting out on his mission the following morning could be attributed to his simple and naive nature, or as evidence of the confidence he feels in performing well at this job, which as we later learn he's been doing for 7 years. Or, as an amalgamation of the two, it could just be down to this cool guy persona he has going on, and actually he's a bit bedazzled by all this.
사장님께서 이거 직접 전해드리랍니다.
네?
사장님께서 이거 직접 전해드리랍니다.
When the girl who is the subject of this whole ordeal arrives home, it's not hard to see what his boss was thinking about when using Sun-woo's inexperience with romance, or with women in general, as reasoning for choosing him. But in actuality, he might just be bad with anyone outside of his job, which I'm sure limits the type of person he would be required to regularly interact with. Nonetheless, he's clearly taken aback by his first interaction with her, somebody ordinary, not because they lack any unusual interests or work a menial job, but because they are so far removed from the lifestyle that somebody like Sun-woo lives in. As we see by her lamp collecting and work as an orchestral cellist, she wouldn't be considered normal by a genuine regular Joe, but this is heightened tenfold just by nature of how far away the plane that Sun-woo exists on really is. We only come to know about these surface level idiosyncrasies when Sun-woo accompanies her to various outings, but the beginning of his interest in her definitely starts at this initial interaction, with an immediately obvious fixation on her general beauty and elegance. Over the course of their very limited time together, the easiest conclusion to come to is that he has fallen in love with her, which is the exact thing he needed to avoid doing in order to emotionally remove himself from the punishment he'll be inevitably required to dish out. But in reality, Hee-soo ends up representing something much more nuanced, something that has a very personal distinction from the state of mind Sun-woo had found himself under for all this time, even if it takes until the final moments of the film for him to realise this himself, and that it wasn't just simple romantic feelings on his part. And that's not just an excuse to write off the obviously romantic elements of the plot here. There's just a much more involved narrative at play that the film deserves credit for.
재미없어.
He may be smitten with her from the start, but the turning point is when he watches her perform at a recital recording session, during which they play the much too suitably titled Romance by composer Yuki Kuramoto. Although he's sat spectating from the recording studio with some of the producers, it's the first time he gets a standstill moment to reflect on his feelings towards her, and the music she's taking part to create acts as an emotional propellant to that. All of the thoughts and feelings that Sun-woo will later find impossible to put into words as justification for his actions come into the fray when Hee-soo presents herself as a force of nature, in direct contrast to the loneliness and pointlessness that fills up his existence. This moment that he becomes totally absorbed in, which we don't even properly see his reaction to and which we cut away from before it's finished, and yet the memory it instills is so strong that it becomes a hidden subconscious element of his personality and principles, which from that point on will guide his actions. She has become less the subject of his love and desire, less a cute girl he's had the fortune of interacting with as of late but has restricted himself from attaching to any further, and more a symbol of the life and emotions that he wishes to experience. She and her performance make him remember the humanity he locked away in favour of the cold-hearted, stone-faced professional persona that he adapted into for the sake of his job, and this epiphany, along with his connected liking of Hee-soo as a person, is something he can no longer ignore. In an alternate reality, he would never catch her in the act of cheating, which his boss had instructed him to do. He would likely have gotten along just fine with what little time he got to spend with her, even if it technically had to remain as part of his job, and he would continue to walk that dangerous fine line between letting her go and sending more restrained affection her way, until the eventual end of this whole task, wherein he would snap out of it like waking from a dream. But unfortunately, such a future could never occur. He was just about ready to make sure the job gets done, but a callback to the littlest of details makes him hesitate, and the following out-of-character decision he makes to protect Hee-soo rather than punish her is the inciting moment of his downfall from that point forward. He even says to them, knowing what his boss is capable of, whether they realise the insanely perilous game they are choosing to play, and I'm sure he's partly instantly regretful of the amount of trust he's having to put in their hands not to screw it up for him as well, because he's well aware of the consequences he would face if the truth ever got out. There must have been some expectation that somewhere down the line this would all lead back to him and result in some sort of punishment, but the close proximity and vicious extent of that is something he severely miscalculates. From this point on, it becomes all the more obvious how it is whatever thoughts and feelings that are bouncing around inside Sun-woo's head which are becoming more the focus, and that the story of a mobster finding himself on the wrong side of multiple criminal factions is just a backdrop to this psychological development motivating him to commit such an out-of-line act as this. The life he has been living of an intimidatingly efficient mob enforcer has revealed itself as existing in an environment which has been greatly contributing to the unhappiness that Sun-woo spends every waking moment pushing down. Something that wouldn't earn nearly as much credit as I'm giving it if not for the fantastic lead performance by byung-hun, as well as those of the entire supporting cast. The impact of such a skillfully reserved yet passionate performance is perfectly summarised by this quote by Tim Brayton for AlternateEnding.com. I might even go so far as to say that the film's ability to feel human and not dim-witted and corny relies solely on Lee's ability to sell Sun-woo as a closet romantic and make it clear just what an impact down to his very core this one woman has on him, and do those things without making a play for us to sympathise with him as a romantic lead. Basically, he has to underplay everything whilst expressing some very subtle non-verbal cues as to how his character is re-evaluating himself because he fell in love. I'm honestly not even sure how that works, and yet Lee does it like it's no big deal at all.
사장님 어떻게 만나요?
잠깐만요.
It's actually quite impressive how quickly Sun-woo gets picked up for defying Mr. Kang, and I guess in some ways it was lucky for him that Mr. Kang wanted a face-to-face confrontation rather than leaving him to be carved up by another gang for different reasons. At no point has Sun-woo shown any concern as to the enemies he was making by disagreeing with, or in their eyes disrespecting, the actions of other gangs or even the actions of his co-workers, whom he definitely has some sort of a rivalry with in competition as to who was Kang's right-hand man.
그런 거 몰라?
너 지금 나한테 설교하냐?
He always had a protective barrier because he was that right-hand man, or at least among his most trusted. He was capable enough to outperform them and therefore justified in disapproving of their methods. But that's thrown out the window when it becomes alarmingly clear that Mr. Kang has opened the floodgates and let the whole crowd in on taking him out, or as Kang instead decides, enacting some seriously demoralising punishment. In the face of such an extreme 180, Sun-woo seems almost stunned with fear over the loss of his protective status, and at a loss for words in the presence of a man who seems unwavering in his conviction. But why is Mr. Kang so sure that he's being lied to? We never see or learn of any solid reason why he would so suddenly become 100% certain of this betrayal, such as having an additional enforcer tailing Sun-woo, or already knowing the truth of the girl's lack of fidelity and using the situation as a test. We can only assume that this is a hunch of Mr. Kang's which he is acting on out of confidence in his own principles.
아니, 그런 거 말고 진짜 이유를 말해. 그냥 솔직하게 말해봐. 나 그애 때문이냐?
In order to make any sense at all of his continued determination to punish Sun-woo, I have devised a theory that there are two versions of Mr. Kang. Two versions which, as supported by the dinner meeting with Sun-woo at the start of the film, he can quickly change between whenever necessary, although it may not be a conscious effort on his part, and there is no basis for the transformation being because of whoever Mr. Kang is currently interacting with. The first version is an intelligently ruthless criminal businessman, not necessarily emotionally subdued, but calm and collected and demanding of absolute control to achieve the most fortunate outcomes. This is the man who, with only so many words, would make one of his highest ranking enforcers reconsider his mannerisms and leave the scene. He's the one who decides on going through with punishing Sun-woo based on a short stare down and an even shorter question.
나 그애 때문이냐?
Who assures his collaborating criminal bosses that the situation is under control,
망치가 가벼우면은 못이 솟는 법이죠.
and who decides to belittle the efforts of the person about to kill him with little more than a repeat of the same simple question.
그애 때문이냐?
The second version is more consistently internally present than the first, but rarely ever does it physically manifest except in moments of trust and comfort. This is Mr. Kang the romantic, with considerably higher efforts towards sensibility and normalcy. It's a glimpse of what Kang might be like if he hadn't spent the past few decades climbing the ranks of the underworld, someone who hesitates to reveal his affinities and attraction to a woman more so out of shyness than a calculated decision.
내가 실은 젊은 애인이 하나 있어. 내가 아끼는 여자야. 나 같은 사람이랑은 다르지, 종이 달라.
Whereas the first version sees fit to so harshly punish Sun-woo out of necessity to make a lasting impression on the rest of the enforcers and ensure they stay in line, the second version feels a genuine personal betrayal against his character, one which has caused him great anger and frustration after he foolishly opened up to one of, if not the only person whom he felt he could trust, or wanted to trust. It affected his business, making him realize he doesn't have the tyrannical hold over his men that he thought, and eventually resulting in everyone's deaths. It ruined his relationship with the girl he was legitimately happy to have snagged, but who it turns out didn't really reciprocate the same feelings anyway, and it permanently tarnished any chances that he would put the same trust in anyone again, certainly not for anything he might have any emotional connection to. I initially thought there might have been an egotistical element to Kang's ruthlessness, which would have suggested that a girl good enough for him would be so amazing in her own right that she would inevitably have other men pursuing being with her, and that, by extension, leads to Kang believing Sun-woo, having interacted with her in any capacity whatsoever, would have fallen for her as well. But I think that argument gets nullified after it's revealed that this isn't the first time Mr. Kang has dealt with the disobedience of a once trustworthy colleague, and you realise the extent of his perfectionism and just how result-oriented he is.
이번 일은 손목 하나로 끝날 일이 아닙니다.
When Sun-woo survives being buried alive, and when given the phone to decide what happens to him next, and he chooses to defy Mr. Kang again by making his escape, it makes you wonder from that point forth whether his punishment is proceeding for his original display of leniency when deciding whether to do as commanded in dealing with Hee-soo and her boyfriend, or if instead it is the consistent refusal to admit that error, or rather than admitting his error of fulfilling the job he was given, it is his failure to admit that the reasoning behind that error was his love for Hee-soo. Mr. Kang even questions the severity of his punishment, and perhaps if Sun-woo had owned up to his blatant disobedience, then it wouldn't have gone this far. However, his inability to communicate the reason or come up with a believable lie in its place, as well as being unable to fathom the reasoning behind this continued injustice dealt upon him, means he and Kang never reach an understanding, and the only way out Sun-woo sees is to eventually remove himself and anyone else in his way from the equation. As an investigation of his motivations for going through such tribulations, let's look at what is undeniably the biggest source of inspiration for his character and for the story he inhabits. The 1967 French film Les Samouraï was consistently noted as a major influence on Bittersweet Life throughout the production process, which should come as no surprise to anyone who has seen both films or is otherwise aware of the sheer volume of other films that have used it as a baseline for their stories. In case you are wondering, here's a short list of some such films. Practically all subsequent films about stoic killers and methodically merciless hitmen or anything close to it have Les Samouraï and Jean-Pierre Melville's impeccably tight directing to thank for it, for making an example of how effective a refined minimalist approach can be, and how compelling a character like this is despite such a simple plot. For Les Samouraï, it was an approach wherein the alluring and cunning anti-hero is mirrored by the director's precise creative decisions, which both embraces the protagonists of classical noir cinema and elevates them into an invigorating new subgenre of crime thriller that had never before been seen.
Je ne parle jamais à un homme qui tient une arme dans la main. C'est une règle. Une habitude.
And for A Bittersweet Life specifically, Kim Ji-woon said he took from Melville two things. The first concerns the level of meaning in which the violence and detached cynicism exposes the vanity of life and love. The second concerns the approach to expressing that meaning, using the capabilities of the actors in their subtle gazes and body language, the absence of exposition or of cleanly lit and composed shots, and then making full use of an exhaustingly strong atmosphere, all in all, having the ability to speak without words. The ideas at play in Who We Know as Sun-woo and Jeff, the main character of Last Samurai, are quite similar, but used to achieve different outcomes. Perhaps the first lesson learned from Melville was the importance of perfect casting, especially when it comes to a face we'll be seeing considerably more of than any other. In order to have the story be expressed in great part via the face of such a character, the right performer needs to be chosen not just for their acting capabilities, but for the natural, unchanging connotations of their being. Disappearing into the role is just a bonus when your casting is as perfect as someone like Alain Delon, who was very famously chosen to play the part of Jeff, and whose piercingly cold eyes holds a certain attractive ambiguity that keeps us on edge as to the intentions or motivations of his character at any given moment. In both Les Samurai and A Bittersweet Life, it's left for the viewer to make what they will of his actions, which remain largely unexplained to the very end. This goes for both films, but I'm focusing on Les Samurai when I say that we know and learn near enough nothing about this man except his profession, and even that seems loosely defined. A hitman or assassin who kills for money without reason because there exists nothing outside the confines of his job. He lives in a blank space, a gloomy, emotionless apartment totally detached from any long-lasting meaningful relationships, besides a faceless supplier and a single accomplice, neither of which he shows any real affection. Yet in spite of this, and in spite of being a cold-blooded killer, we root for his success for no other reason than that he carries a constant solemn loneliness and principles of respect and loyalty to his word. Jeff has an ethical code of some sort, that much is clear, and whilst it's never explained, we come to admire and even share his perspective to the extent of hoping he finds the way out of this mess. Both characters seem to sacrifice themselves, but whether their death has any true purpose, any effect on the events following the film's end, is unclear. Is it a suicide out of a recently surfaced desire to free themselves from whatever boundaries have been imposed on them by the need to make decisions that they no longer care for? With Sun-woo, you can understand the possibility that he's going through this far further than anyone else deems necessary, out of a hope to give freedom to Hee-soo, so that she no longer has Mr. Kang to worry about punishing her and her boyfriend. Jeff's female friend, who helped cover for him against the police investigation, could be used as a similar explanation if she's one of the few people he cares for, or out of his principles to help those who helped him in the past. I can see why he thinks self-sacrifice might exclude her from any legal repercussions.
C'est non.
The real answers to each of their deaths, however, might be a more selfish one. These men who are sick of the world they live in and sick of themselves, who each have reasons to believe that a world they might want to live in is out of their reach, find peace in death from the total denial of one's responsibilities.
Pourquoi, Jeff?
On m'a payé pour ça.
The thing that makes A Bittersweet Life so interesting as a comparison piece to Les Samouraï is the wildly different approach to reach this conclusion. As is fitting of Melville, he felt it befitting to use a stylish ennui, meaning a lack of enthusiasm, as an expression of Jeff's expertise and his jaded worldview. For Kim Ji-woon, the decision was to create a series of increasingly enervating experiences for Sun-woo to combat, leaving us with spikes of adrenaline rushes, intermittent with an ever-increasing wariness, that each time leaves the film feeling nearer its destructive end. For maximum effect, the film keeps a hold of this realistic aesthetic, with messy hand-to-hand fight scenes and loud chaotic shootouts beyond what would have been expected from even other Eastern action movies, let alone Western ones. For that reason, along with the narrative psychological efforts cooperating with the brutal actions Sun-woo partakes in, everything is more believable and more exciting, which ultimately proves to be more suitable for the grittiness in these Korean films than the elegance in Les Samouraï would have been. All of this in combination has set the stage for a much needed alteration of the details encompassing Sun-woo as a character, someone who I would say is much more confused and broken than Jeff appears to be. Whilst Jeff seems mostly in control of his actions and decisions, Sun-woo is manipulated by others and misguided by his own delusions. And the key scene that brings everything to fruition is the ending, where Sun-woo shadowboxes against his own reflection. Used as a way of visualizing the character's inner essence, it shows us how Sun-woo likes to think of himself and how he perceives others thinking of him as well. Or, in the words of the director, he thinks of himself only as reflected in other people's view of him, and he believes to be like that. I wanted to convey the idea that, in the battle against himself, he lost. But what happens to a person when their sense of self is entirely defined by the ideas others have of them? Well, in Sun-woo's case, it has led him to living an extremely bittersweet existence for the past 7 or so years, with no purpose besides an unending dedication to somebody who deliberately hides any possible remorse from throwing him away. The irrational behaviour that has resulted in this cycle of violence, born from a glimpse at the true beauty of life in the eyes of somebody with a childishly twisted view of the world, is almost ironic in its blatancy. So many times we've seen the story of an action hero taking responsibility of the safety of somebody vulnerable under their wing at the risk of their own demise. And the tragic nature of Bittersweet Life comes from Sun-woo acting as an archetype of those heroes, when in actuality he's in over his head, and the girl he feels motivated to protect isn't as innocent or as vulnerable as he chooses to believe. When faced with the prospect of a torturous death, he definitely seems panicked or scared, and yet he continues this facade of the badass action hero that he wants others to view him as.
절대로 우리가 가만두지 않는다.
He has an unrealistic make-believe mindset in an unforgiving realistic world, and it's only down to his genuinely good fighting skills and insane luck that he survives as long as he does, but succeeding in his goal to get back at the injustice dealt against him and to give Hee-soo freedom from Mr. Kang comes at the expense of throwing away any chance of survival. It's almost like he feels there's a duty he must fulfill in order to complete this character trope he's turned himself into, but he isn't really all that calm and dominative as he pretends to be, and pretending to be only gets him so far compared to the real thing. When trying to sound cool in reply to something his enemy has said, he stutters his lines and gives an embarrassed look, like he's internally beating himself up for the idiot he just made himself look like. And then the scene just doesn't play out like he was expecting it to in his head when that person surprise stabs him in the gut. In the opening fight scene, he deals with the situation swiftly and stylishly, in complete control, and accurately calculating his movements to look like an action star. The same can't be said for his alarmingly chaotic escape, where the hyper-intense camera work, messy cuts, and unscripted feeling as to the direction the scene takes accommodates this state of panic he's in, where he's flailing about, doing anything he can to survive. In that moment, he was hit with a sense of humility that he can't afford to sacrifice any efficiency in his actions in order to appear more composed. And that's just when he's around other people. Even when totally alone, as if he were a method actor of some sort, he still partly keeps up this act, rather than doing anything that would give life outside his job more meaning. A bare-bones apartment where he spends his evenings drinking beer and sleeps on the sofa as if keeping lookout for the night, and the little game of switching the light on and off to see if anyone's there as the most minor of adrenaline rushes. It's no wonder then, upon meeting the somewhat seductive Hee-soo, who as part of her own act appears to be the perfect candidate for a vulnerable girl in need of protection that he's been looking for, that Sun-woo would so quickly become attached. She might have her suspicions, but clearly isn't all that informed about Mr. Kang and Sun-woo being a part of a criminal organisation, which is why Sun-woo just kind of quietly goes along with being labelled as a hotel enforcer.
아저씨 해결사죠.
그때 명함 드렸었잖아요. 저 호텔에서 일하고 있어요.
She proves to be quite entitled and cold towards Sun-woo, angrily dismissing him immediately following the sparing of her and her boyfriend's lives. And they never directly communicate again from that point on. It's safe to say that whatever love he was imagining or hoping existed from her in regards to him was never really there, and it's sad to think that all his subsequent suffering goes completely unnoticed by her. The lamp she opens from the package that Sun-woo had left her is something she might not even construe as coming from him. After all, the lamp at the start was a gift from Mr. Kang, and if we assume that she's been out of town for a few days and that the last she saw of Mr. Kang was their bedroom chat, then she might have no idea as to who was dead or alive, and her first thought is probably that of confusion as to why another lamp would be sent. Either way, it's not a look of surprised happiness over getting another lamp. It's more like a "what's this supposed to mean" reaction, which could be towards Mr. Kang or Sun-woo.
저 잘못 건드렸어요. 몸 관수 잘하세요.
It often happens in life that big tragedies originate in something really small. Most people tend to look for explanation only in bigger visible events, whilst overlooking smaller, apparently insignificant happenings. Sometimes you suffer from love pains and eventually discover that you lost your love just because of some small, silly reason. A Bittersweet Life is about how the love that remains unexpressed, the love that only looks, suffers in silence. It's also about how Sun-woo comes to the realization, perhaps a little too late, that the problem was inside himself. But I guess it turned out that this pursuit of vengeance was a necessary evil in the process of learning that truth, and it has led him to this moment. The cynical juxtaposition between this writing, La Dolce Vita, meaning the sweet life, and the frame of two men at a most dramatic ending to their lives is just the right ironic touch that I've come to expect from Korean revenge cinema. It's also fitting that the Korean title more accurately translates to that very saying, which I think is a much more humorous contradiction of where Sun-woo ended up. as he looks over to the reflection that at one point, perhaps 7 or so years ago, he would have been happily shadowboxing against. He thinks, where did it all go wrong?